Picture this. The executioner's hands don't grip a swift blade or a merciful axe. Instead, they clutch a pair of red-hot iron pincers, glowing like embers from hell itself. In a field just outside Munich, 10,000 souls have gathered, their voices falling into an eerie silence that seems to swallow the very air around them. They know what's coming. They know this won't be quick. They know they're about to witness something that will scar their memories forever. On the crude wooden scaffold, a woman named Anna Papenheimer kneels in the dirt, her body already shattered from days of unspeakable torture. But her torment isn't over. The cruelest twist? She's forced to watch her two grown sons chained to posts nearby, their eyes meeting hers in a moment of shared desperation that no parent should ever experience. What happens next will make your blood run cold. The executioner moves toward her, those burning pincers catching the morning light like instruments of the devil himself. They close around her chest. The sound that tears through the silence isn't a scream. It's something far worse. It's the sound of a human soul realizing that mercy has completely abandoned this world. But here's the thing that will keep you watching until the very end. This wasn't about justice. This was never about justice. This was a public theater of cruelty, a warning written in scorched flesh and spilled blood, designed to terrorize an entire nation into submission. And the most shocking truth of all? The Papenheimer family was completely innocent. This level of calculated, orchestrated brutality doesn't just happen overnight. It has to be built, piece by agonizing piece, like a machine designed specifically for human destruction. To understand how one ordinary family, just trying to survive in a world that had already rejected them, could become the centerpiece of Germany's most infamous witch trial, we need to uncover the political conspiracy that demanded not just their deaths, but their complete and utter obliteration. Before we dive deep into this nightmare that actually happened, hit that subscribe button. It's the fastest way to join us for every exploration into the darkest corners of history that most people never hear about. The story of the Papenheimer family begins with death itself. In a small Bavarian town where Anna grew up, her father held a job that everyone needed but nobody wanted to see. He was the gravedigger, the man who touched death with his bare hands, who lived in the shadow between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. In a society where superstition ran deeper than religious faith, this single fact branded him and his entire bloodline as permanently unclean. Imagine young Anna, maybe 6 or 7 years old, walking through the bustling market square. Watch what happens. The other children scatter like she's carrying some invisible plague. Mothers instinctively pull their little ones closer, whispering protective prayers under their breath. The baker refuses to hand her bread directly, instead dropping it on the wooden counter and stepping back as if her very touch could contaminate him. This is what it means to be born into shadow, to carry a mark from birth that labels you as something less than fully human. But here's where the tragedy really takes root, because social isolation creates its own gravitational pull. The outcasts inevitably find each other, drawn together by their shared understanding of what it means to be permanently other. That's exactly how Anna met Paulus. He was another pariah, another soul marked by his father's profession. His family cleaned sewers and handled waste, doing the jobs that kept society functioning while society despised them for it. Their marriage wasn't just about love, though genuine affection clearly existed between them. It was about survival, two people who understood what it meant to be permanently outside, permanently other, building a fortress of two against a world that had already written them off. When they stood before that priest and made their vows, they weren't just creating a union. They were declaring war on a society that wanted them to disappear. But love, even desperate love, brings its own complications. The early years brought children, first Simon, then little Gumprecht, and finally the youngest, Michel. With each birth, Anna and Paulus must have felt that bittersweet mixture of overwhelming joy and absolute dread that comes with bringing innocent life into a world that had already marked you for destruction. These weren't just their children. These were more souls born into the shadow, more lives that would carry the permanent stain of their parents' untouchable status. And this is where our tragedy really begins to take its horrific shape, because being poor in Bavaria at the turn of the 17th century was already a death sentence waiting to happen. The 30 Years' War was brewing like a storm on the horizon. Religious tensions crackled through every town and village like electricity before lightning strikes. Fear hung in the air so thick you could taste it. But being poor and ritually unclean, being the family that everyone already associated with death and filth, and everything decent people refused to acknowledge, that combination would prove absolutely catastrophic. The Papenheimers tried desperately to build something resembling a normal life. Paulus took whatever work he could find, fixing broken things, hauling heavy loads, anything that didn't require social acceptance or human decency. Anna raised the children, teaching them the most important survival skill of all: how to keep their heads down, how to be invisible, how to exist without being noticed. They moved constantly, always living on the margins, always one step ahead of complete destitution, always hoping the next town might be different, might be kinder. But here's the cruel mathematics of social isolation. When you're already seen as tainted, every single misfortune in the community starts to bend toward you like iron filings drawn to a magnet. A farmer's cow dies unexpectedly. People remember that the gravedigger's daughter walked past that field just last week. A well suddenly runs dry. Someone recalls seeing Paulus near it recently. A child falls sick with fever. Wasn't the waste handler's family staying in town when it started? These weren't direct accusations yet. Just whispers, meaningful glances, the slow but deadly accumulation of unease that would eventually crystallize into something truly monstrous. The family scraped by for years this way, existing in the spaces between legitimate society like ghosts that everyone could see but nobody wanted to acknowledge. They lived in ramshackle quarters on the edges of towns, in the areas where nobody else wanted to set foot, among Bavaria's invisible people, necessary for society to function but despised for existing, human but never quite human enough to matter. And here's what makes their story so heartbreaking, it's almost unbearable. They were just trying to live. In all the historical records, in all the surviving accounts, there's absolutely no evidence of any wrongdoing beyond the unforgivable crimes of poverty and the pure misfortune of birth. They were a family exactly like any other, with parents who loved their children fiercely and children who trusted their parents completely. They shared whatever meager meals they could find, told stories by candlelight, faced hardships together with a kind of quiet courage that never makes it into history books. The social death sentence passed on them at birth should have been tragedy enough. It should have been their only burden to bear. But in Bavaria in 1600, being an outcast wasn't just uncomfortable or limiting, it was about to become a literal death sentence. The Papenheimers couldn't know it yet, but their very existence had marked them as perfect victims for a horror beyond human imagination. They were about to learn that in a world gripped by fear and superstition, being nobody meant you could be transformed into anybody's monster. But being shunned by society was one thing. Soon, their very existence would become a crime punishable by death. Knock, knock, knock. For the Papenheimer family, every sound from the outside world carried the potential for disaster. By 1590, Bavaria had made poverty itself illegal. The wandering poor, the beggars, the families without permanent residence, they weren't just unwanted anymore. They were criminals, and the penalties for their crimes were severe. The Papenheimers, forever moving from town to town in desperate search of work and basic survival, fell directly into this newly criminal category. Picture the constant tension that must have consumed their daily existence. Every time Paulus left their temporary shelter to search for day labor, every time Anna ventured out with the children to beg for scraps of food, they were committing acts punishable by imprisonment, public humiliation, or worse. The sound of horse hooves on cobblestones sent hearts racing with terror. Was it just a merchant passing through? Or was it the town guard, coming to drag them away. You have to understand what desperation does to the human spirit. It makes people take risks that seem absolutely insane from the comfort of safety. One night, with their children crying from genuine hunger, their small bodies weakened by days without proper food, Paulus made a decision that would haunt the family forever. He had heard whispers about work, actual steady employment that paid real wages. The catch: it was the worst job imaginable in all of Bavaria. Cleaning privies, handling human waste, becoming the official filth handlers of the community. The waste workers of Bavaria weren't just poor. They occupied the absolute bottom rung of society's ladder, so low that most people refused to acknowledge their existence entirely. They worked exclusively at night, moving through the darkness like shameful secrets to empty the cesspits and privies of respectable townspeople. They literally handled human filth, and that filth clung to them in the minds of everyone they encountered, marking them as permanently contaminated. But it was work. It was survival. It was a chance to feed their starving children. And this is where the family acquired their infamous name, Papenheimer. Not their real surname, but a label, a brand burned into history that marked them as the lowest of the low. In some historical accounts, the name came from the paper used in privies. In others, it was a corruption of a place name. But the exact origin matters less than what it represented. You are filth, you handle filth, you are exactly what you handle. Picture Anna's face when Paulus came home with this news. The desperate relief at having steady income warring with the absolute horror of what it meant for their family's future. Their children would now carry this stigma forever. Little Michel, barely old enough to understand the concept of social shame, would grow up as the son of the Papenheimer, the waste handler, the night crawler, the thing that decent people didn't acknowledge in daylight. The job meant they could settle in one place, at least temporarily. They found lodging, if you could dignify it with that term, in the worst part of town, where the stench from the tanneries mixed with the smell of poverty and human desperation. But even this stability was nothing more than an illusion, because now they weren't just outcasts. They were visible outcasts with a title, a role, a presence in the community that people could focus all their disgust and hatred upon. The work itself was back-breaking and soul-crushing. Paulus would leave as darkness fell, wrapping himself in rough cloth, carrying the crude tools of his degrading trade. He'd move silently from house to house, estate to estate, descending into the pits where human waste accumulated in putrid pools. The sound of his shovel scraping against stone, the splash of filth being loaded into carts, these became the soundtrack of the family's nights, the rhythm of their survival. But here's what the cold historical records can never capture: the small moments of humanity that persisted in the midst of this systematic degradation. Anna keeping the children quiet during the day so Paulus could sleep after his night of horror. The family sharing their meager meals, finding joy in impossibly small things. A successful day of begging, a kind word from a stranger, the simple miracle of being together when the rest of the world wanted them separated or dead. The children grew up carrying the mark of their father's profession like a scarlet letter. Other children threw stones and screamed names that stung worse than any physical blow. Papenheimer. Papenheimer. The chant followed them everywhere, turning their family name into a curse, a weapon used to wound them daily. Simon, the eldest, learned to fight back with his fists when words failed him. Gumprecht became quiet and withdrawn, turning inward to protect what remained of his spirit. Little Michel clung to his mother's skirts, not understanding why the world seemed designed to inflict pain on his family. And through it all, the fear never left them, because being a legal waste handler was only marginally better than being an illegal beggar. One missed tax payment, one complaint from a prominent citizen, one night when Paulus was too sick to work, any of these could send them back to the roads, back to being criminals simply for the act of existing while poor. The family had traded one form of social death for another. They were now the official pariahs, the acknowledged untouchables with names, addresses, a documented place in the community hierarchy. But that place was at the very bottom, in the darkness, handling the waste and shame of their supposed betters. They had become the official bogeymen of their town, working in shadows and secrecy. They had no idea that a real monster was about to speak their name, and when he did, it would transform them from outcasts into something far worse, scapegoats for an entire nation's fears. It all started with a captured thief, a desperate man in a prison cell who would say absolutely anything to save his own worthless skin. The year was 1600, and in a Munich prison that reeked of human misery and despair, a condemned criminal faced his interrogators with the knowledge that execution loomed like a shadow over his remaining hours. He'd been caught red-handed with stolen goods, and his fate seemed sealed in stone. But then the authorities offered him something more precious than gold, a deal. Give them information about other crimes, other criminals, and perhaps, just perhaps, mercy might be found for his soul. The thief, whose name history barely bothers to record, began to talk. And talk. And talk some more. At first, his confessions were painfully mundane. He named accomplices in petty robberies, pointed accusing fingers at other small-time thieves, recounted minor crimes that barely warranted attention. But his interrogators wanted more, much more. In an era where every misfortune was blamed on supernatural forces, where every unexplained death whispered of dark magic, they pressed him relentlessly about witchcraft, about devil worship, about the murders of innocent children that plagued every parent's nightmares. And that's when the thief spoke the name that would doom an entire family: Papenheimer. The accusation he crafted was nothing short of a masterpiece of grotesque invention, so detailed and horrifying that it seems almost impossible one human mind could conceive it. The Papenheimers, he claimed with apparent conviction, weren't just waste handlers scraping by on society's margins. They were serial killers who stalked pregnant women through the dark streets of Bavaria, hunting them like predators seeking prey. They murdered these women for their unborn children, he continued, his voice growing stronger with each lie. And here's where the fabrication became so monstrous it took on a life of its own. They used these unbaptized infants to create magical candles. Candles that, when lit, would render anyone who carried them completely invisible to human eyes. Candles made from the rendered fat of innocent babies, crafted through rituals so evil they defied human comprehension. Think about the diabolical genius of this particular lie. It combined every parent's worst nightmare with the deepest superstitions of the age, creating a perfect storm of horror that would be almost impossible to dismiss or ignore. It took a family already associated with filth and darkness and transformed them into literal monsters who hunted in the night. The waste handlers who worked in shadow became predators who killed in shadow. The interrogators leaned forward with hungry interest. This was exactly what they wanted to hear, not necessarily because they believed it at first, but because it was so sensational, so absolutely horrifying, that it would justify anything they chose to do next. The thief, sensing their fascination and seeing a path to potential survival, began to elaborate with increasingly wild details. The Papenheimers had been doing this for years, he claimed, dozens of victims, maybe hundreds. They had built an entire network of accomplices spanning multiple towns and regions. They held regular meetings with the devil himself, receiving instructions for their murderous work. The family's children were fully involved, trained from birth to assist in these supernatural crimes. Now, you have to understand the psychology at work here. Bavaria in 1600 was a powder keg of religious tension and social anxiety just waiting for a spark to ignite it. The Catholic Counter-Reformation was in full swing, with Protestants and Catholics viewing each other with deep suspicion and barely contained hatred. Tales of witches and devil worshippers provided a common enemy that everyone could unite against, a focus for all their fears and frustrations. And who better to fill that role than a family of outcasts that everyone already despised? Who more perfect than people who had no powerful relatives to object, no social standing to complicate matters, no voice that anyone would listen to or believe? The thief's confession spread through the authorities like wildfire consuming dry wood. Here was the answer to every unexplained death, every missing person, every stillborn child that had haunted the region's collective nightmares. The Papenheimers, of course. Those who handled the city's filth in darkness, who lived permanently on the margins of society, who had always been somewhat less than human in the public eye. It made perfect, horrible sense. But here's the truly terrifying part that should chill your blood. The accusation was so extreme, so detailed, so horrifying that it created its own credibility. Surely no one would fabricate something so grotesque without reason. Surely there must be some truth to such elaborate claims. The very monstrousness of the lie became its own proof. its own justification. The authorities didn't investigate further. They didn't look for evidence or corroborating witnesses. Why would they need to? They had a detailed confession from a criminal who seemingly had nothing to gain by lying. They had a perfect set of suspects in the Papenheimers, powerless, despised, unable to defend themselves effectively. And most importantly, they had a crime so sensational that solving it would bring glory and recognition to everyone involved in the process. Word began to spread beyond the prison walls like poison seeping through cracks in stone. Whispers in the market squares, hushed conversations in taverns, fearful discussions in homes where children slept. The story grew and mutated with each telling, as stories always do. The Papenheimers weren't just killing pregnant women now. They were conducting elaborate satanic rituals. They weren't just making candles. They were selling them to an entire underground network of criminals and witches. The family that had been merely despised was transforming in the collective imagination into something else entirely. Bavaria's greatest threat, the embodiment of every fear that kept decent people awake at night. And all the while, the Papenheimer family continued their miserable existence, completely unaware that their names were being spoken in halls of power, that their fates were being decided by men they had never met, that a condemned thief's desperate lie had just lit a fuse that would explode their world into fragments. Paulus still cleaned privies in the darkness, his back aching, his hands raw from the work. Anna still struggled to feed her children, stretching every coin until it screamed. Simon, Gumprecht, and little Michel still faced the daily humiliations of their social status, still endured the stones and curses of other children, still clung to the hope that somehow, someday, things might get better. They had no idea that a lie so monstrous it defied belief had just created its own reality, and that reality was about to reach the ears of the most powerful man in all Bavaria. A man who would see in their supposed crimes exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for. As the Papenheimer family was brutally dragged from a squalid tavern in heavy chains, half a world away in terms of privilege and power, a man in an opulent palace was looking for the perfect example to make. Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria was a ruler with ambitions that stretched far beyond his borders, dreams that consumed his every waking moment. He wanted to be remembered as the champion of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the defender of the true faith, the iron-willed ruler who would restore order to a chaotic world spinning out of control. But he faced a significant problem that kept him awake at night. His subjects were restless, anxious, consumed by fears about witches and devils and the complete breakdown of social order. They needed something dramatic, something that would demonstrate his power and his unwavering piety in one decisive, unforgettable stroke. When the detailed report about the Papenheimers reached his ornate desk, Maximilian must have seen it as a gift from God himself. Here was the perfect opportunity falling directly into his hands. A family of outcasts accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable, with no powerful relatives to object, no social standing to complicate legal matters, no voice that anyone of importance would listen to or believe. Just a group of human refuse who could be transformed into a lesson that would echo across all of Europe. The arrest happened at dawn, when the world was still wrapped in shadows and most decent people were safely in their beds. Picture the scene with all its calculated brutality. Paulus stumbling from the tavern where the family had taken shelter for the night, still groggy from exhaustion after hours of degrading labor. The thunder of armed boots on cobblestones, soldiers in full military armor. Far more than would ever be necessary for arresting a family of beggars, but perfect for creating the impression that these were dangerous criminals requiring overwhelming force. The children's screams echoed off the buildings as they were torn from their mother's desperate arms. Anna fought them with the fury of a cornered animal. Of course she did. The historical records specifically note that she had to be physically subdued, that she cursed and spat and clawed like a wild beast. But what mother wouldn't react that way, seeing armed strangers seizing her children, knowing instinctively that this was the end of everything? Little Michel, only 10 years old, clung to her skirts until a soldier pried his small fingers away. Gumprecht tried to run but was caught within a few steps, his child's legs no match for trained men. Simon, the eldest, stood frozen in place, perhaps understanding better than the others that resistance was not only futile but would only make their punishment worse. The neighbors watched from windows and doorways, some crossing themselves in fear, others turning away in shame or disgust, but nobody intervened. Who would dare? And more to the point, who would risk their own safety for the Papenheimers? They were being arrested not as individual people, but as symbols, and everyone understood that distinction instinctively. Meanwhile, in his palace surrounded by luxury they could never imagine, Maximilian was already planning the show trial that would make his reputation. This wouldn't be some quiet affair in a local court, quickly forgotten by history. This would be a spectacular demonstration of divine justice that would echo across all of Europe, establishing his credentials as a ruler who would tolerate no evil in his realm. He personally ordered that the best interrogators be brought in from across the region, that no expense be spared in extracting detailed confessions from the accused. The guilt of the Papenheimers was never in question in his mind. The only question was how to make their guilt serve the greatest possible political purpose. Here's the cold calculation that sealed the family's fate like a death warrant. Maximilian needed them to be guilty of more than just murder, more than simple crimes that anyone might commit. He needed devil worshippers, proof of a vast supernatural conspiracy, evidence that Satan himself was moving against Bavaria, and that only the Duke's iron fist could protect the faithful from damnation. The Papenheimers would be the stars of this morality play, whether they knew their lines or not. Whether they were actually guilty or not was irrelevant. They had been cast in their roles, and they would play them to the bitter end. The family was separated immediately upon arrival at the prison. This was standard procedure, but it served a darker purpose than simple security. Alone, terrified, each family member would be infinitely more vulnerable to what was coming next. Paulus was thrown into the men's section, a cell barely large enough for him to lie down. Anna was placed in isolation that was even smaller and more degrading. The children, and this detail should chill your blood to ice, were housed with hardened criminals who had been specifically encouraged to terrorize them with graphic tales of what happened to which spawn. The machine of justice began to grind with mechanical efficiency, but justice had absolutely nothing to do with what was happening. Letters flew between the palace and the prison like messages between conspirators. Maximilian wanted regular updates, detailed confessions, names of accomplices. Most of all, he wanted a show that would demonstrate his power and religious devotion to rivals and subjects alike. The Papenheimers had ceased to be human beings the moment that thieves spoke their name in desperation. Now they weren't even criminals in any real sense of the word. They were props in a political theater, their bodies soon to become the canvas on which Maximilian would write his message of absolute authority and unwavering religious devotion. The monstrous efficiency of it all should terrify anyone who believes in justice or mercy. A family nobody would miss, accusations so sensational they would capture public attention across the continent. A ruler who needed to demonstrate his power through spectacular cruelty. The Papenheimers stood at the intersection of all these forces, and they would be utterly crushed by them. They were no longer people with hopes, dreams, fears, or love for each other. They were ingredients in a recipe for political success, and that recipe called for their complete destruction in the most public and horrifying way imaginable. In the stone silence of the torture chamber, truth becomes irrelevant. The only thing that matters is making the unbearable pain stop, even if stopping it means confessing to crimes that exist only in nightmares. The interrogation of the Papenheimer family began with what the authorities euphemistically called showing the instruments, a psychological torture designed to break spirits before the physical torture even began. They brought each family member, one by one, into a stone chamber deep beneath the Munich prison. The walls were lined with devices designed by twisted minds for the sole purpose of creating unbearable human agony. The rack that would stretch bodies until joints separated. The thumbscrews that would crush bones to powder. The boots that would compress legs until circulation stopped and tissue began to die. The pincers that glowed red-hot in braziers, ready to tear flesh from bone. They started with Paulus. The logic was coldly practical. Break the father, and the rest of the family would follow like dominoes falling in sequence. They stripped him completely naked, shaved his entire body. Standard procedure ostensibly to search for devil's marks, but really designed to increase his humiliation and vulnerability. And then they began their methodical work. First came the thumbscrews, tightened slowly, deliberately, while the interrogators asked their questions in calm, reasonable voices. When he maintained his innocence, insisting through gritted teeth that they were just a poor family who had never harmed anyone, they moved to the boots, wooden devices that compressed his legs until circulation stopped and the tissue began to turn black with death. But Paulus held out for hours, maybe even days. He clung to the truth like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. They were innocent, he repeated through waves of agony. They were just trying to survive. They knew nothing of magic or devils or murdered children. They had never hurt anyone except themselves through the crime of being poor. The interrogators, growing frustrated with his stubborn refusal to confess, decided to escalate their methods in the most cruel way imaginable. They brought in Anna, positioning her where Paulus could see her face, could hear every sound she made, could watch as they prepared to destroy the woman he loved. The interrogators knew exactly what they were doing. Physical pain has limits. The human body can only endure so much before unconsciousness provides escape. But watching someone you love suffer, being forced to witness their agony while being powerless to help, that breaks people in ways that no instrument of torture can match. They positioned Anna's torture devices where Paulus could see everything, could watch as they prepared to systematically destroy her body. The historical records are deliberately vague about what exactly was done to Anna, but we know it was methodical, escalating, designed to break not just her flesh but her very will to resist. And more importantly, it was designed to break Paulus by proxy, to use his love for his wife as a weapon against his sanity. Each scream that tore from Anna's throat was worse than any torture they could inflict on him directly. Each whimper, each plea for mercy, each moment when she looked at him with eyes full of pain and betrayal, these became the instruments that finally shattered his resistance. And this is where the confession began to take shape, not as truth emerging under pressure, but as the only currency that might possibly buy some small mercy for the people he loved. Paulus began to talk, his voice broken, his spirit crushed. Yes, they had killed people. Yes, they had made candles from infant fat. Yes, they were everything the accusers claimed and worse. The interrogators, finally getting what they wanted, pressed for more details, more names, more evidence of the vast conspiracy they needed to justify their actions. How many had they killed? Where were the bodies buried? When did they first make contact with the devil? How did they create their magical implements? The numbers that emerged were staggering in their impossibility. 400 children murdered, their bodies processed for magical materials. The absurdity of the number should have been immediate proof of the confession's falseness. When would a family struggling simply to survive have had time to murder 400 children? How would such a massive crime spree go completely unnoticed by neighbors, authorities, anyone? But logic had no place in that stone chamber where pain ruled supreme. The interrogators coached and shaped their responses, guiding them toward a narrative that fit the political needs of the moment perfectly. They needed specific details about satanic rituals, so the Papenheimers provided them. They needed evidence of a conspiracy that would justify widespread fear and repression, so the family invented one from their shattered minds. Each torture session added new layers to the fiction, new horrors that they remembered, when the alternative was continued agony. Anna's confession was particularly elaborate and impossible. Under systematic torture that broke her body and mind, she admitted to flying through the night on a demonic pitchfork, to grinding up the bones of infants for magical powders, to sexual congress with demons that left physical marks on her body. The confession was so detailed, so full of supernatural claims that it reads today like the fever dream of a mind completely destroyed by pain and terror. But in 1600, it was accepted as gospel truth, recorded carefully by scribes who showed no doubt about its accuracy. The children were not spared this horror. Even little Michel, just 10 years old, was subjected to what the records euphemistically call mild torture. What that actually meant for a child, the documents mercifully don't specify in detail, but we know that he too confessed, admitting to helping his parents in their supposed crimes, to participating in rituals that no child could possibly understand or perform. The sight of their parents broken and bleeding, the threats of what would happen if they continued to resist, the isolation and terror of being surrounded by adults who treated them as monsters, it all combined to make even the children complicit in writing this fiction of supernatural horror. By the end of weeks of systematic torture, the Papenheimers had confessed to being monsters beyond human imagination. They had agreed to every accusation, embellished every detail their torturers suggested, created a complete mythology of evil that would haunt Bavaria for generations to come. The confessions were written down in careful legal language, signed with hands that could barely hold a pen, sealed with the authority of pain and absolute desperation. The interrogators had everything they wanted, a complete narrative of diabolical crime that justified everything that would come next. The Papenheimers had been transformed from a poor family into the authors of their own destruction, their agony translated into the legal fiction that would kill them in the most horrible ways imaginable. But the machine of persecution wasn't finished with them yet. Having created monsters, it now demanded that those monsters feed it even more victims. The corruption was about to become complete. Imagine the ultimate moral corruption, being forced to destroy innocent people just to earn a single moment's peace from unbearable agony. The interrogators weren't satisfied with confessions from just the Papenheimer family. A conspiracy involving only 5 people wouldn't create the sensation that Duke Maximilian needed to establish his reputation. They needed a vast network, a web of evil that would justify widespread persecution and demonstrate the Duke's power to root out corruption wherever it might hide. So they returned to that stone chamber with a new demand that would complete the family's transformation from victims to instruments of mass destruction. Names. They wanted the names of accomplices, co-conspirators, fellow devil worshippers who had participated in their supposed crimes. Paulus lay on the floor of his cell, his legs useless masses of crushed bone and dying flesh from the torture boots, his hands mangled beyond recognition from the thumbscrews. When the interrogator entered carrying a pitcher of water, just clean water, but to a man who hadn't been allowed to drink in days, it might as well have been liquid gold. The bargain was made explicit with brutal simplicity. 1 name equals 1 sip, the name of an accomplice in their supposed crimes, and Paulus could wet his cracked, bleeding lips with a few drops of water. Think about that moment, the absolute degradation of a human soul reduced to trading innocent lives for the basic necessity of hydration. Paulus knew with whatever rationality remained in his shattered mind that these people were completely innocent. He knew this because he was innocent, because his family was innocent, because the entire confession was nothing more than a fabrication born from weeks of systematic torture. But his body screamed for relief with a voice louder than conscience, and his mind had been broken by experiences no human should endure. The first name came out as barely a whisper, a neighbor who had once shown them kindness, perhaps the only person in their community who had ever treated them as fellow human beings. The interrogator smiled with satisfaction, allowed Paulus a small sip of water, then demanded another name, and another, and another. Each name brought a moment's relief: water, a loosening of chains, a brief respite from active torture. But each name also added another link to an ever-growing chain of destruction that would soon strangle entire communities. Anna faced the same devil's bargain in her own cell. They told her that Paulus had already named dozens of accomplices, that resistance was pointless because the conspiracy was already exposed. Why protect people who were already doomed to suffer? Why endure continued agony for those who would soon be screaming in agony themselves? And didn't she want to see her children again? Didn't she want their suffering to end? All she had to do was confirm the names Paulus had given, and add some of her own to the list. The children were manipulated with different, but equally effective psychological techniques. They were told that their parents had already confessed everything, that holding back names would only anger God further, and make their family's punishment even more severe. Little Michel, confused and terrified beyond anything a child should experience, began naming everyone he could think of through his tears. The baker who had once given them stale bread, the tavern keeper who had occasionally let them shelter from rain, even other beggar children they had encountered on the endless roads of their wandering existence. The interrogators carefully recorded every name with meticulous attention to detail. They cross-referenced the lists, looking for patterns and connections, building their case for a massive satanic conspiracy that supposedly reached into the very heart of Bavaria. When the Papenheimers finally ran out of names of people they actually knew, the interrogators helpfully suggested some possibilities. What about the miller's wife? Didn't you say you saw her at one of those nighttime gatherings? And the tortured family, desperate for any approval, any hint of mercy, would eagerly agree. Yes, of course, the miller's wife. How could they have forgotten? By the time the naming session ended, over 400 people had been implicated in this fictional conspiracy. 400 souls marked for investigation, interrogation, possible torture, and likely death. All because a desperate family had been forced to trade names for water, for a moment without pain, for the false promise that cooperation might somehow save them from their predetermined fate. The virus of accusation spread outward from that torture chamber like ripples in a poisoned pond, contaminating everything it touched. Some of the named fled their homes immediately, their sudden departure taken as absolute proof of guilt. Others were arrested in dramatic raids, and under their own sessions of systematic torture, they too began naming names, adding new victims to an ever-expanding web of manufactured guilt. The fiction that the Papenheimers had been forced to create took on a terrifying life of its own, growing and mutating with each new victim, becoming more elaborate and more impossible with every confession extracted through pain. But here's perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all. The Papenheimers knew exactly what they had done. In their few moments of clarity between torture sessions, they must have been haunted by the faces of those they had condemned, tormented by the knowledge that their pain had been weaponized against innocents just like themselves. The interrogators had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They had taken one family's agony and transformed it into a tool of mass persecution that would devastate entire communities. The Papenheimers had given them everything they could possibly want: detailed confessions, horrifying specifics, and most importantly, a network of supposed accomplices that justified the widespread action Duke Maximilian craved. The conspiracy he needed now existed on paper, signed and sealed in blood and broken bones, ready to be presented to the world as proof of his vigilance and divine authority. The machine of persecution was fully operational now, grinding through innocent lives with bureaucratic efficiency that would make modern dictators envious. And at its dark heart were the Papenheimers, broken and emptied, having served their purpose as the seeds of a manufactured panic that would consume hundreds of lives. They had surrendered over 400 names, sealing the fates of countless others who had never done anything worse than show them basic human kindness. The trial that would follow was already a foregone conclusion. Now all that remained was the public spectacle of their complete annihilation, designed to burn itself into the collective memory of everyone who witnessed it. The execution of Paulus Papenheimer was not justice. It was a meticulously choreographed performance of sadism designed for maximum public impact and political effect. July 29, 1600. Dawn broke over Munich with the deliberate sound of drums and church bells, announcing to the entire city that this day would be different, that history was about to be written in blood and screaming. This was not going to be a simple execution that people would quickly forget. Duke Maximilian had ordered a spectacle that would be remembered and discussed for generations to come, a demonstration of power so complete and so horrifying that it would serve as a warning to anyone who might even think about challenging his authority. Workers had spent days preparing the route from the prison to the execution grounds outside the city, setting up wooden barriers to control the massive crowd expected to attend this unprecedented display. The Papenheimer family was awakened before dawn, their sleep interrupted by guards who seemed almost eager for what was to come. They were roughly washed, dressed in the traditional white shirts of the condemned, and prepared for their final journey through a world that had never wanted them alive. But first, there was one more calculated act of cruelty that reveals the true nature of what was happening. The authorities brought the family together one last time. Paulus, Anna, their adult son Simon, and the younger boys, Gumprecht and Michel. They were allowed to see each other, to say goodbye, knowing with absolute certainty that within hours they would all die in agony in front of tens of thousands of spectators. The procession began at exactly 6 in the morning, time to catch the largest possible audience as the city awakened. Paulus was placed in a wooden cart, his broken legs unable to support his weight. But this wasn't an act of mercy, it was pure practicality. They needed him conscious and fully aware for every moment of what was to come. Anna and Simon were forced to walk, heavy chains clanking with each step, the sound echoing off the buildings like a death knell. The younger boys were carried by guards, their small bodies overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening around them, their minds unable to process that this was real, that this was actually happening to their family. Along the 2-mile route through the city, the executioner's assistants had strategically set up stations where specific tortures would be inflicted on Paulus as the crowd watched in fascination and horror. At the first station came the red-hot pincers, heated until they glowed like pieces of the sun, tearing chunks of flesh from his arms and chest while he screamed in agony. The smell of burning human meat filled the morning air, and still the procession never stopped. This was theatre, and the show absolutely had to go on. At the second station, they tore at his legs with the pincers, the metal sizzling as it contacted his skin. At the third station, they attacked his back, leaving him a mass of burned and bleeding wounds. Each injury was calculated with scientific precision to cause maximum pain without killing him prematurely. The executioner was a consummate professional who knew exactly how much the human body could endure before death provided escape. Between stations, priests walked alongside the cart in their fine robes, urging Paulus to repent, to embrace God's mercy before his death. The bitter irony was lost on no one with eyes to see. They were systematically torturing him in the name of the same God whose forgiveness they demanded he seek. The crowd's reaction was mixed in ways that reveal the complexity of human nature under extreme circumstances. Some cheered each new torture, caught up in the bloodlust of the moment, their humanity temporarily subsumed by mob mentality. Others watched in horrified silence, perhaps recognizing with growing dread that this could be them, their own families, if they ever fell afoul of the authorities or were unlucky enough to be accused by the wrong person. Children were held up on their fathers' shoulders to see better, to learn through direct observation what happened to those who supposedly consorted with the devil. This was education through terror, a lesson that would be burned into young minds forever. Anna was forced to watch every single moment of her husband's systematic destruction. This too was carefully calculated torture, not physical but psychological. The agony of seeing the man she loved reduced to a screaming, bleeding mass of barely living flesh, while knowing that her own fate would be identical or worse. Simon stood beside his mother throughout this nightmare, and the historical records note that he tried desperately to comfort her even as he faced his own approaching death. The younger boys were kept slightly apart, but close enough to hear everything, to understand with dawning horror what was happening to their father and what awaited them all. When the procession finally reached the execution ground outside the city walls, Paulus was more dead than alive, but the performance was far from over. He was tied to a large wooden wheel, his broken body displayed for all 10,000 spectators to see clearly. In a normal execution by breaking wheel, the condemned would traditionally receive a mercy blow to end their suffering quickly and allow them to die with some shred of dignity. But Paulus was denied even this small grace, this tiny mercy that might have shortened his agony by mere minutes. He was left to die slowly on that wheel, each labored breath a monumental struggle, each moment an eternity of pain. The symbolism was deliberately clear and unmistakable. This man was so evil, so far beyond any possibility of redemption, that he deserved no mercy whatsoever from God or man. The crowd was meant to see this and remember it forever, to understand that Duke Maximilian's justice was absolute and his power unlimited, that those who threatened the social and spiritual order would face suffering beyond their worst nightmares. As Paulus lingered on the wheel, gasping and moaning in sounds that barely seemed human anymore, the executioner calmly prepared for the next act of this carefully orchestrated horror show. Anna was brought forward, her eyes locked helplessly on her dying husband, forced to watch his final moments while knowing that her own death was approaching with each tick of the clock. The stakes were ready, the fires were lit and crackling hungrily. But first, there would be one more performance, one more calculated cruelty designed to burn itself into the memory of every witness and ensure that no one present would ever forget what they had seen. The execution of the Papenheimer family was entering its final, most horrifying act, and the worst cruelties were yet to come. Everything until now had been merely prologue to the main event that would ensure the name Papenheimer echoed through history as a synonym for judicial murder and the complete corruption of justice. We return now to the moment where our story began, with Paulus dead on his wheel of agony, and the executioner turning his attention toward Anna. What he did next was designed not just to kill her, but to shatter the very souls of her surviving children and leave scars on their psyches that would last for their brief remaining lives. Anna Papenheimer stood bound to the wooden stake, the executioner's blade catching and reflecting the morning sunlight like a mirror of death. Her husband's broken body was still visible on the wheel, a grotesque monument to the Duke's version of justice, while her sons watched with eyes that would never recover from what they were being forced to witness. The executioner didn't immediately light the pyre that would consume her. First came what can only be described as a final degradation that was an assault on motherhood itself. As the crowd pressed forward for a better view, as her young sons Michel and Gumprecht were held firmly by guards to ensure they couldn't look away, the executioner tore open Anna's shirt. What happened next was the symbolic destruction of the body that had nursed these children, that had been their first source of comfort in a cruel world that had never wanted them to exist. Her breasts were cut away with deliberate precision, and the mutilated flesh was forced against her sons' mouths in a mockery of maternal nurturing that perverted the most sacred bond between mother and child. The crowd fell silent. Even in an age of routine public executions, even among people accustomed to witnessing death as entertainment, this was shocking beyond words. This wasn't simply killing, it was the deliberate annihilation of everything sacred about family, about love, about the relationship between mother and child. Michel, only 10 years old, would carry this image seared into his memory for the brief remainder of his life. Gumprecht's face, according to one witness who recorded the event, went completely blank, as if his young mind simply refused to process what was happening, shutting down to protect itself from trauma too great to comprehend. Only then, after this final humiliation was complete, did they light the fires that would consume what remained of Anna Papenheimer. She died not just as a condemned witch, but as a mother whose final moments had been deliberately engineered to cause maximum psychological trauma to her children, ensuring that their last memories of her would be corrupted by unimaginable cruelty. The flames rose higher and higher, consuming everything. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many of them silent and shaken by what they had witnessed. But the show wasn't over yet. There was still more Papenheimers to kill, more examples to be made. Simon, the eldest son, was beheaded with a single stroke, a relatively merciful death compared to what his parents had endured. But mercy was purely relative in this orchestrated nightmare of state-sponsored murder. He died knowing that his parents had been tortured to death for crimes they never committed, knowing that his young brothers would soon follow him into the grave, knowing that their family name would forever be synonymous with evil in the minds of everyone who heard it. The authorities had saved a special fate for little Michel that was arguably worse than immediate execution. At 10 years old, he was considered too young to be executed immediately. Even Duke Maximilian's twisted version of justice maintained some pretense of legal procedure. Instead, they subjected him to something that might have been crueler than a quick death. He was forced to watch every single moment of his family's destruction, while guards ensured he didn't look away or close his eyes. Officials carefully recorded his reactions for posterity, noting down his tears, his screams, his desperate pleas for mercy that fell on completely deaf ears. After the executions were complete, and his family was nothing but ash and memory, Michel was placed in the custody of Jesuits who would attempt to save his soul through months of religious indoctrination and systematic psychological abuse. He was rebaptized with a new name, told daily that his parents had been monsters who richly deserved their horrible fate, forced to pray for forgiveness for sins he had never committed and crimes that had never happened. For 3 months, this child lived in a purgatory of forced religious conversion and psychological trauma designed to break whatever spirit remained in his small body. But the authorities had always intended to complete their total destruction of the Papenheimer bloodline. On November 26, 1600, Michel was strangled and then burned like refuse, a 10-year-old boy murdered by the state for the unforgivable crime of being born to the wrong family. Gumprecht met the same fate, though the records are less clear about the exact timing of his death. The Papenheimer case sent shockwaves of terror throughout Bavaria and beyond. The 400 names extracted under systematic torture led to dozens more arrests, more sessions of torture, more executions in a spreading circle of death that seemed to have no end. Entire families abandoned their homes and fled rather than risk accusation by someone desperate to stop their own pain. The social fabric of entire communities tore apart as neighbors began to wonder who might name them under torture, who might sacrifice them to buy a moment's relief from agony. Duke Maximilian achieved everything he had wanted and more. He was celebrated throughout Catholic Europe as a defender of the true faith, a ruler strong enough and dedicated enough to root out evil wherever it might hide. The Papenheimer executions became legendary, cited for decades afterward as definitive proof of the reality of witchcraft and the absolute necessity of harsh measures to combat supernatural evil. Religious authorities praised his devotion. Political allies admired his strength. Even his enemies grudgingly respected his willingness to take decisive action against threats to Christian civilization. The Duke's reputation was made, his place in history secured, his political goals achieved through the systematic torture and murder of innocent people. But here's what we must never forget, what we must carry with us as we remember this story. The Papenheimers were completely innocent. They were nothing more than a poor family, guilty of absolutely nothing beyond the misfortune of existing on the margins of a society that had no place for them. Their only real crime was being powerless when power needed victims to sacrifice on the altar of political ambition. Their story isn't about witchcraft or supernatural evil or divine justice. It's about how fear and politics can transform ordinary people into monsters in the public imagination, and then destroy them for the very monstrosity that was forced upon them through torture and coercion. It's about how the machinery of justice can be corrupted into an instrument of oppression when those in power need scapegoats to blame for social problems they can't or won't solve. The name Papenheimer lives on in historical memory, but not as the family would have wanted. It lives as a permanent reminder that civilization is always just a few accusations away from barbarism, that justice without mercy becomes nothing more than elaborate cruelty, and that the most dangerous magic of all is the spell that makes us see devils and monsters where there are only desperate human beings trying to survive in an indifferent world. Every time we hear about witch hunts, about mass hysteria, about innocent people destroyed by false accusations, we should remember the Papenheimers. Remember Anna, forced to watch her husband tortured to death before facing the same fate herself. Remember Paulus, broken on the wheel for crimes that existed only in the fevered imagination of his torturers. Remember Simon, beheaded for being born to the wrong parents. Remember little Michel and Gumprecht, children murdered by adults who convinced themselves they were serving God. Their story teaches us that the greatest horrors in human history don't come from supernatural evil or demonic influence. They come from ordinary people who convince themselves that cruelty serves a higher purpose, that suffering can be justified if it achieves the right political or religious goals, that some human beings matter less than others and can be sacrificed for the greater good. The Papenheimers died horribly, but their story survives as a warning about what happens when fear overrides compassion, when politics corrupts justice, when society decides that some people are expendable. Their names were written in agony, but their legacy is a reminder that we must never stop questioning authority, never stop demanding evidence, never stop insisting that every human life has value regardless of social status or family background. In a world that seems increasingly divided, increasingly willing to demonize the other, the story of the Papenheimer family stands as a stark reminder of where unchecked fear and hatred ultimately lead. They were innocent people destroyed by a system that needed them to be guilty, and their screams echo across the centuries as a warning that we ignore at our own peril. The executioner's pincers have been silent for over 400 years, but the lessons of their story burn as bright and urgent as ever.